Let's get this holiday party started right, shall we? I suppose for the descendants of Africans brought to this land against their will, enslaved and tortured and abused for almost 2.5 centuries, that's 240 years for folks who really need that enumeration, who continue to endure segregation and racial discrimination and racist terrorism long after that, and who continue to experience the economic and societal devastation of 3 centuries of that reality today. The whole Thanksgiving myth centered on a friendly exchange between pilgrims from England landing on Plymouth Rock and having a lovely, happy, communal celebration feast with the indigenous people who helped them survive when they got here and didn't know how to plant crops never really held much sway. We didn't believe that stuff. I mean, as much as the public school system in this country tried really hard to indoctrinate our kids into believing that lie with the little turkey and pilgrim construction paper cutout projects and the school plays where our kids were instructed to act out this fake history, most of us grew to know that this history could not possibly have been true because as we learned about our own history, we understood that the people who enslaved our ancestors could not possibly have been nicer to the indigenous than they were to our folks. Even if we didn't understand what settler colonialism was, we knew that much, which of course is why this history is taught the way it is in this country as the massive lie that it is. Because see, those who shaped history, of course, don't want us to really know that the Thanksgiving story is a lie, because then we'd have to admit that the U.S. really is a big settler colonial experiment that spread like a virus across the world at this point. Because the truth of the matter is that the Pilgrims didn't hang out at Patuxet, the Wampanoag village they landed near. They were only there for a short period of time, but it was long enough that they somehow felt it was their right to rename the place Plymouth, spelled Plimoth at the time, which is what settler colonists do, because they claim stuff for themselves that already belonged to someone else. One of the ways they begin that process is by erasing the original names of places and calling them something that they want. That is, of course, before they start systematically removing the people who were there in the first place. But before we get to all that, the feast part of this holiday that's supposed to be based in history is also a lie. Because while the European settlers who wandered their way over to Massachusetts did have a feast, the Wampanoag people were not, in fact, a part of it. The assistance they provided those folks that made it possible for them to even have a feast wasn't even acknowledged by the people who benefited from that assistance. According to written accounts of the feast that is allegedly the basis for this Thanksgiving feast that we know today, Pilgrim leaders gave toasts at that small celebration, and not once did any of them thank the indigenous people for sharing their resources and knowledge, literally helping the Europeans to not die. But even though they weren't invited or even mentioned by those folks, the Wampanoag did show up, except it was to remind those ungrateful Europeans that they were on the land of the Wampanoags and were being allowed to stay. And this is important to understand because what's never told in this lie about how America came to be was that Europeans had been wandering over to Turtle Island and raiding indigenous villages, enslaving people, stealing their food and seed stores, and even raiding graves and stealing funerary offerings for nearly a century. Nearly 100 years before this fictional Thanksgiving feast with those indigenous people was supposed to have happened. This is the other thing that settler colonists do. They refuse to give credit for their survival to the people who were there first, and they always underplay or outright lie about the abuses of those people that they committed. Oh, they'll thank God and all that, but they won't thank God for those people who could have been hostile to them and let them die off, but who instead were kind and helpful and showed them a humanity and a decency that they never, ever reciprocate, especially when those original people had every right to repay their hostility with hostility to protect themselves and their way of life. And then you've got the fact that the first official Thanksgiving holiday wasn't even about this historical fabrication. It was actually established in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, who established it on the day that we recognize it to this day, the last Thursday in November, as a way to unite the country after the Civil War. And then on top of that, the whole idea of the Pilgrims fleeing Europe, that was even a fabrication, even though it was true that there was persecution of religious groups that were non-conforming to the British Crown's reestablishment of the Church of England, which I believe is Anglican. But let's not get the idea that the so-called Pilgrims were themselves tolerant of anyone else's religion or actually came here to escape persecution. They didn't. It was all political. They were here because they wanted stuff. They wanted to make money. That whole narrative of the settlers founding America for religious freedom was actually a fabrication weaved from the New England Protestant communities to establish themselves at the top of the hierarchy in the colonies above other religious and immigrant groups. And we all know how that played out, don't we? So you got all these lies crafted by various factions in this country, basically to cover up the selfish, hateful, and blood-soaked actual history of the establishment of the colonies by these settler colonists, which, by the way, is why we keep calling them pilgrims and not the settler colonists that they were. And then you've got everyone's favorite nice guy president, John F. Kennedy, stating in his Thanksgiving Day proclamation in 1963, quote, "We give our thanks, most of all, for the ideals and honor and faith we inherit from our forefathers, for the decency of purpose, steadfastness of resolve, and strength of will, for the courage and the humility which they possess and which we must seek every day to emulate," end quote. Ideals and honor that the settlers actually did not possess, neither did their descendants, who went on to ignore the slaughter of the indigenous whose land they stole in telling their story, crafting their story, and went on to enslave Africans whose freedom they stole. Look, I can't tell you what to do on this holiday, but I can tell you that for most Black folks and probably quite a few of our Chicano relatives, few of us who get together with family on this holiday do it to commemorate any of this made-up Thanksgiving concoction. Mostly for us, it's a federal holiday, and most of us working class folk can get this day off, or at least part of the day off. So it's one of the few days of the year that the whole family is able to have the time to come together. But while we gather, maybe, just maybe, we can check out the actual history behind all of these carefully woven lies that need to be undone. Check out the history and resources provided by the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe at herringpondtribe.org. There are some great articles in the Cape Cod Times dispelling these myths that we must unlearn. And I do encourage you to grab a book written by David Silverman, a historian and professor at George Washington University, called "This Land is Their Land: The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving." Whatever else you do on this made-up holiday, please make it your business to learn the real history behind it and eradicate the settler colonial whitewashing of it that tried to erase both the atrocities the settlers committed and the people they committed them against. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.